lastly, I promised to tell you who the Cartwrights were. Would you like to know? Take about 5 minutes.
Sure.
Sure. I'll be happy to tell you, since I promised you. Last year when I saw some lady kicked off of Cartwright, I just was outraged. I tucked into research the whole issue of public access on Cartwright. And, as I researched it, I found something very interesting. It became very interesting. I wanted to find out, when did the name change from Ram Island? And who was it named for? It turns out that this had been something that had been forgotten at one point by the 1930s. Morton Pennypacker, the famous Long Island historian who was the East Hampton town librarian in the 30s and 40s, put a notice in the paper saying, does anybody know? Because he didn't know who the island was named for. But by the 1940s, I found some documents some letters from the East Hampton Library to a Cartwright family member inquiring about it. And he had, by that time, figured out that Cartwright Island was named for a C. Cartwright, who was a first mate on a schooner called the Idabel. It wasn't very informative, but I chased it down and found, through old newspaper clippings from the 1870s and from writings from Elizabeth Cartwright, who was a writer for the East Hampton Star in the 1930s, pieced together the story. And in fact, Cartwright Island is named for two Cartwrights who were father and son, both heroes of shipwrecks. Captain Frederick Cartwright was, as a young man, the first mate on a whaling schooner called the Hohansett, which sailed out of Sag Harbor. And they took on a crew in Honolulu and unfortunately went down on a reef about 1,000 miles northwest of Honolulu. And they hit this reef. They were able to get off in their boats and go to a small island where they came back. It was 12 miles away or so. They scavenged their ship and they built a new boat. Frederick and 6 others sailed 1,000 miles back to Honolulu. It took them something like 43 days. They sailed through a 3-day typhoon. They were all starving, exposure, all kinds of problems. But they got back to Honolulu and they sent back a boat to rescue all of their comrades. And so he was a hero, came back, local hero, raised a family here in Amagansett with about 5 or 6 kids. They were in Amagansett, probably sailing around Gardiner's Bay all the time, visited Cartwright Island with their dad, who unfortunately died only a few years later, and they say from injuries sustained during his ordeal in the Pacific. A few years later, his son, Clifford Cartwright, is the first mate on a ice boat, a clipper ship that's taking, a schooner maybe, that was taking ice from Maine, I think, down to New England. And they were passing by Wellfleet or Massachusetts when a blizzard struck on April 4th, 1876. And the blizzard was intense and the waves were huge, and none of the crew could stand at their posts. Only the captain and Clifford were left standing at the wheel, and the captain was washed down the gangway. Clifford was alone at the wheel. And the captain told him to take cover. Clifford refused, stayed at the wheel, lashed it so that the boat was headed straight for the shore of Wellfleet, and he was washed overboard by a wave and drowned. The boat, however, struck the shore, and the crew was able to get off because of his actions. So he was honored as a hero. His body washed up about a month later. And the story was written up by his cousin, Elizabeth Cartwright. So that's who Cartwright is named for. And they're buried in the cemetery by the windmill side by side, Frederick and Clifford Cartwright. And blue-collar heroes, not royalty, no royal grants, no privileges, just ordinary Bonnickers.
Thank you very much for that history.
Sure.
Thank you, Rod.